first I want to talk about an equally important story, because free speech has been a huge issue this week. We've seen Dame Sarah Khan's report. I interviewed her a couple of days ago. 76% of people saying that they have self-censored. They haven't said certain things in their homes and workplaces, in any sort of public situation. They're worried about being cancelled. Well, there's now a piece of legislation that's due to come into place in Scotland, the Hate and Public Order Scotland Act. That comes into force on the 1st of April, so Monday week, criminalises threatening or abusive behaviour which is intended to stir up hatred based on certain characteristics, including age, disability, sexual orientation, and, big shock, transgender identity. Well, let's talk to Susan Smith. She's director of For Women Scotland. Susan, you're very welcome to the programme. What do you make of this legislation, Susan?
Thank you. Well, the immediate problem is not so much the legislation, although there are many, many issues with the legislation, but the fact that the police service, what we can discern so far from the training the police have been given, is that it's highly biased, and it doesn't even reflect the law, which is bad enough to start with. And it's been deemed not fit for purpose by both the past and the current chair of the Police Federation in Scotland.
So what are police officers who will, of course, have to slightly interpret but also enforce this law? What have they actually been told in Scotland and by Police Scotland, or at least those who are training them, and Police Scotland presumably spending money on training to give to these officers?
Well, according to the current chair of Police Federation, they've been given a sort of online 2-hour training package that often doesn't actually represent the law. So it has the incidence of a high-profile politician being called a rude name on the street. And this is actually a direct reference to something that happened to Patrick Harvey, who's one of the keenest proponents on
he's a Green Party politician, isn't he? MSP, I think, rather than an MP?
That's right. He's an MSP and he's the leader of the Scottish Greens. He's also a minister in the Scottish government, and he was one of the people who was
They might argue, like, this is a real-world example. This is something that actually happened, and this is how the law is changing, and this is what you should do about it. Surely that's a reasonable example, is it not?
Well, it's not, because it doesn't really meet the threshold for a crime. Well, it doesn't meet the threshold for a crime, and it doesn't meet the threshold I would consider for stirring up. But this is the problem, that we've got this very grey area where the police aren't sure. And it's this stirring up part of the bill that's been problematic. So we've had hate crime for a while in Scotland and covering these protected characteristics, but it's an aggravator. So if you commit a crime and it's motivated by hate, by racism, or by homophobia, for example, you get a harsher sentence. But what this new Act is saying is that if you distribute material that people think is harmful, or if you say things that people think are upsetting, you can also be prosecuted for this very vague crime of stirring up hatred.
But no one has the right not to be offended, but it seems that maybe they do now with this change.
Yeah, I think that's right. I
could say your scarf offends me. Does that mean you get arrested? By the way, it's a lovely scarf.
Well, no, because I'm only a lowly woman, and one of the things about hate crime legislation is they establish hierarchies about who is protected, who the government considers worthy and who they don't consider worthy. So you can run around saying all sorts of nasty things about women, and that won't meet any threshold for any crime.
So if you make really sexist remarks, if I said something terrible about, all women and belong in the kitchen or something like that, yeah, that would not be considered as part of this. But if I say, trans women are actually men, that would be something that would be considered as part of it.
Yes, and they will say that, no, you won't be done for saying trans women are men, but we know people are reporting people already for comments like that. Only yesterday, or Monday rather, we found out that another MSP had been reported to the police for saying that a non-binary identity was as valid as claiming to be a cat. And
in fairness, there'll be lots of people who will report all sorts of things, but the police may not necessarily do something about it. But you're right, there is definite confusion here and a real nervousness about what this law is actually going to mean.
That's right. And especially because the police have said they're going to investigate all of these complaints. So even if they investigate them and find there's nothing criminal has occurred, they might still log, for example, a non-crime hate incident, and that can come up in an advanced disclosure check. So if you're wanting to work with children or vulnerable adults, you might be told you can't do that work because the police have got a file on you based on all these spurious and malicious complaints.
Listen, thank you very, very much indeed. We'll keep a very close eye on this, and we'll continue talking to Susan Smith there. She's Director for Women Scotland. And thank you to lots of people who've been in touch. Simon in Aberdeen says another half-baked, I thought, rubbish law from the SNP and Greens. Terry in Ramsbottom says, just because you're offended doesn't mean you're right. You're absolutely correct, Terry. And David McKay, or Mackay, I'm not sure, says this bill is overwhelmingly not supported by the actual people in Scotland, being pushed through by one of the most divisive and hated politicians I've ever seen in 45 years of living in Scotland. SNP out, says David McKay, referring, I think, to Humza Yousaf, who is the First Minister of Scotland.